The air in Vicksburg hung thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms and human suffering. In the summer of 1851, the Mississippi River town thrived on cotton, commerce, and the chains that bound thousands of souls to a life of perpetual servitude. The grand mansions lining Washington Street stood as monuments to wealth built on stolen labor, their white columns gleaming under the merciless sun, while the people who built them remained invisible, nameless, disposable. Before we continue with this story of unimaginable resilience, if you're finding value in this narrative, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. Sarah's story began not in Vicksburg, but on a sugarcane plantation in Louisiana, where she was born to a mother whose name she would never know. Sold away at age 6, she carried only fragments of memory. A lullaby hummed in the dark, calloused hands braiding her hair, the smell of earth after rain. The auction block became her first clear memory, the place where childhood ended and a different kind of existence began. A tobacco trader purchased her for $30, along with 3 other children, transporting them upriver in chains to be resold at premium prices in Mississippi's booming market towns. By the time Sarah reached Vicksburg at age 7, she had already learned the fundamental lessons of survival under slavery. Never look directly into white eyes. Never speak unless spoken to. Make yourself small, make yourself useful, make yourself invisible. The Witmore family purchased her as a house servant, a role considered prestigious among the enslaved community, but which carried its own particular torments. Field work broke the body with brutal efficiency, but housework exposed you to constant surveillance, to the unpredictable moods and casual cruelties of those who claimed ownership of your very breath. The Witmore estate sprawled across 5 acres on the eastern edge of town, a testament to the cotton fortune that Lawrence Witmore had accumulated over 2 decades. The main house rose 3 stories high, its Greek Revival architecture speaking to aspirations of refinement and civilization, even as the institution that funded it represented humanity's darkest impulses. Behind the main house stood the kitchen building, the laundry house, the stables, and finally, set back near the property line, the weathered cabins where the enslaved population lived, 23 souls whose labor maintained the illusion of southern gentility. Sarah's duties centered on the 2nd floor of the main house, where Margaret Witmore held court over her social circle like a queen presiding over her realm. Mrs. Witmore had cultivated a reputation as one of Vicksburg's most sophisticated hostesses, her weekly gatherings attended by the wives of planters, merchants and politicians who shaped the town's destiny. These women saw themselves as paragons of Christian virtue and feminine grace, their conversations flowing from the latest fashions arriving from New Orleans to the proper management of household servants to the moral necessity of maintaining the peculiar institution that made their lifestyle possible. The mistresses of Vicksburg's elite families formed a tight-knit circle, united by shared class interests and the unspoken competition that defined their social interactions. Margaret Witmore positioned herself at the center of this network, her position secured by her husband's wealth and her own calculated charm. Around her orbited 7 other women, each representing a prominent family. Catherine Brennan, whose husband owned the largest dry goods store in town. Eleanor Hayes, married to a cotton factor who controlled much of the region's trade. Victoria Pemberton, wife to a steamboat magnate. Josephine Crawford, whose family had owned land in Mississippi since territorial days. Sarah Louise Mitchell, a judge's wife with political aspirations. Amanda Thornton, married to the bank president, and Rebecca Chandler, whose physician husband attended to Vicksburg's wealthy white families. These 8 women gathered every Thursday afternoon in the Witmore parlor, a ritual as fixed as the seasons. They arrived in their finest day dresses, their hair arranged in elaborate styles that required hours of enslaved labor to achieve, their conversations peppered with French phrases that signaled their cultivation and refinement. They sipped tea from imported china, nibbled delicate pastries, discussed the affairs of their social circle with surgical precision, and casually determined the fates of the human beings they owned, with the same breath they used to comment on the weather. Sarah moved through these gatherings like a ghost, refilling teacups, clearing plates, standing motionless in the corner awaiting commands. She had learned to make her face a mask, to show nothing of the thoughts that moved behind her eyes, to perform the role of the loyal, simple-minded servant that white comfort demanded. At 11 years old, She had already mastered the terrible art of erasure, of being present in body while hiding every authentic part of herself in a place they could not reach. The other servants had taught her the unwritten rules that governed survival in the Witmore household. Old Thomas, who worked the stables and had been enslaved by the Witmores for 30 years, warned her to never show intelligence around the mistress. "She don't like nobody thinking they smart," he explained in a whisper one evening. "Had a girl here before you, taught herself to read by watching the children's lessons. Mrs. Witmore found out, had her sent to the fields down in Louisiana. Never saw that girl again." Patience, who supervised the kitchen, instructed Sarah on the precise temperature Mrs. Witmore preferred for her tea, the exact angle at which to hold the serving tray, the proper response to every command. "Yes, ma'am," delivered in a tone that conveyed deference without personality. The house itself seemed to absorb the violence it contained, its elegant rooms holding memories of beatings administered in the name of discipline, of families separated by sale, of women violated in hallways and children born into bondage in the quarters out back. The floorboards creaked with the weight of secrets. The walls bore witness to countless acts of casual cruelty. The very air carried the accumulated grief of those who lived and died within its confines without ever truly being seen as human. Sarah's routine began before dawn each day. She rose in the darkness of the cabin she shared with Patience and 2 other house servants, washing her face in cold water from a wooden bucket, dressing in the simple cotton shift provided for her work. By the time the first light touched the eastern sky, she was already in the main house stoking fires in the upstairs bedrooms, preparing the washing water, laying out Mrs. Witmore's clothes for the day. The work continued without pause until well after dark, serving meals, cleaning chambers, attending to endless demands, punctuated only by the brief periods when she was dismissed to eat her own meager rations in the kitchen. The physical labor was exhausting, but it was the psychological weight that truly crushed the spirit. Every moment required vigilance, every action subject to scrutiny and potential punishment. A teacup refilled too slowly might earn a sharp slap. A perceived look of insolence could result in hours standing in a corner or worse. The mistress's mood shifted like summer storms, unpredictable and destructive, and Sarah learned to read the subtle signs that might indicate which version of Margaret Witmore she would face on any given day. The Thursday gatherings brought their own particular tension. 8 mistresses meant 8 sets of eyes watching, 8 potential sources of complaint, 8 women who might take offense at some imagined slight and demand punishment. Sarah had witnessed other servants disciplined for infractions so minor as to be almost invisible. A fold in a napkin not quite perfect, a moment's hesitation before responding to a command, the mere suspicion of listening too closely to conversations not meant for enslaved ears. On a Thursday in late August, as the afternoon heat made the air shimmer and thick, the 8 women gathered as usual in the Witmore parlor. Sarah stood in her designated corner, her posture perfect, her eyes downcast, her mind carefully blank. The conversation that afternoon centered on the upcoming social season, on who had been invited to what gathering, on the subtle hierarchies and alliances that governed their world. Eleanor Hayes mentioned that her husband had just purchased a new enslaved woman, fresh off the boat from Virginia, strong girl, good breeder. The others murmured approval, discussing the prices and qualities of human beings as if comparing livestock at market. Victoria Pemberton complained about her cook, who had supposedly ruined a roast the previous week. "I had her whipped, of course," she said casually, selecting a petit four from the tray Sarah held before her. 10 lashes. She won't make that mistake again. The other women nodded sympathetically, several offering their own stories of servant infractions and the punishments administered. They spoke of violence with the same tone they used to discuss recipes or needlework, as if the infliction of pain was simply another household management task to be efficiently executed. Margaret Witmore steered the conversation toward her recent acquisition of new parlor furniture from New Orleans, describing the carved rosewood and silk upholstery with evident pride. The others admired her taste, though Sarah detected the undercurrent of envy that colored their compliments. These women existed in constant competition, each seeking to establish superiority through displays of wealth, refinement, and social connections. Their enslaved servants served as both labor force and status symbols, their very bodies representing capital investment and social position. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's legs began to ache from standing motionless for hours, but she showed no sign of discomfort. She had learned to enter a state of mental distance during these gatherings, to let their words flow over her without fully registering their meaning, to protect some small part of herself from the psychological assault of being treated as furniture with a pulse. But some words penetrated the protective barrier she had constructed around her consciousness, words that would plant seeds of awareness that would, in time, grow into something the Mistresses could never have anticipated. Josephine Crawford mentioned with satisfaction that her husband had sold 3 enslaved families the previous week, breaking them apart to maximize profit. The mother made such a fuss, she said with a dismissive wave, crying and carrying on as if she were white. I told James he should have gagged her before the sale. Such displays are unseemly. The other women murmured agreement, several commenting that enslaved people had no real feelings, that their attachments were merely mimicry of true human emotion, that separating families was no different from separating animals. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a small crack in the foundation of endurance she had built. She had long since learned not to think about her own mother, about the separation that defined her earliest memory, about the countless other losses that punctuated her short life. But hearing these women discuss the deliberate destruction of families with such casual indifference, as if the love between parent and child was meaningless when it existed in black bodies, something in that moment refused to stay buried. She kept her face carefully neutral, but behind her eyes a dangerous thought began to form. These women were wrong. They had to be wrong. The love she had felt in those fragmentary early memories, the grief she still carried for a mother whose face she could barely remember, the bonds she observed among the enslaved community, who found ways to care for each other despite everything. These were real, these were human, these were true, which meant that the entire structure of lies these women lived by, the myths they told themselves to justify their actions, the casual cruelty they inflicted without conscience, all of it rested on a foundation of deliberate delusion. The realization was dangerous. To see the truth of her own humanity was to see the magnitude of the injustice, and to see the magnitude of the injustice was to risk drowning in rage that had nowhere to go. No safe outlet, no possibility of expression without inviting destruction. So Sarah did what she had always done. She pushed the feeling down, buried it deep, maintained her mask of blank servility, while something fundamental shifted in the architecture of her inner world. The Thursday gathering ended as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The Mistresses departed in their carriages, leaving behind teacups to be washed, pastries to be cleared, furniture to be returned to its proper arrangement. Sarah moved through these tasks mechanically, her body performing the familiar routine, while her mind remained far away, turning over the dangerous thoughts that had taken root that afternoon. The autumn of 1851 brought cooler temperatures to Vicksburg, but no relief from the suffocating atmosphere of the Witmore household. Sarah moved through her 12th year with the practiced efficiency of someone twice her age, her small hands performing tasks that left them raw and cracked, her body adapting to the relentless demands placed upon it. The dangerous thoughts that had taken root during that August afternoon remained hidden, carefully buried beneath layers of enforced compliance, but they grew nonetheless, fed by each new cruelty she witnessed, each casual act of violence, each conversation among the Mistresses that revealed the depths of their moral corruption. The Thursday gatherings continued with clockwork regularity, and Sarah's role in them became increasingly complex as Mrs. Witmore demanded ever more elaborate presentations for her social circle. The refreshments grew more sophisticated, requiring additional labor in the kitchen. The parlor arrangements became more ornate, necessitating hours of preparation. Margaret Witmore had decided to elevate her position among Vicksburg's elite through displays of refined taste, and this ambition translated into intensified pressure on the enslaved workforce that made her aspirations possible. October brought a new development that would prove significant in ways no one could have anticipated. Catherine Brennan's daughter, 15-year-old Elizabeth, began attending the Thursday gatherings as part of her introduction to the social rituals of Southern womanhood. Elizabeth watched the older women with careful attention, absorbing their mannerisms, their conversational patterns, their casual exercise of power over the enslaved servants who attended them. Sarah observed the girl's education in cruelty, watched her learn to dismiss the humanity of those who served her, saw the process by which one generation transmitted its poisonous values to the next. But Elizabeth proved more complex than the simple replica of her mother that Sarah had anticipated. The girl sometimes caught herself mid-sentence, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face when the conversation turned to particularly brutal subjects. Once, when Victoria Pemberton described in graphic detail the whipping she had ordered for her cook, Sarah noticed Elizabeth blanch slightly, her teacup trembling in her hand. The moment passed quickly, the girl recovering her composure and forcing a smile that matched the others. But Sarah had seen it, a crack in the armor of indifference, a suggestion that not everyone accepted the system's cruelty with equal comfort. The insight was dangerous in its own way, because it complicated the clear lines Sarah had drawn in her understanding of her world. If some white people questioned the violence, even momentarily, even silently, then the system was not simply an inevitable force of nature, but something maintained by choice, by complicity, by the active suppression of moral doubt. This realization somehow made everything worse, because it meant that the suffering was unnecessary, that it could stop if enough people chose differently, but that they continued to choose violence anyway. November arrived with unseasonably cold weather, and the Witmore household prepared for the winter social season. The Mistresses planned an elaborate Christmas gathering, and Mrs. Witmore threw herself into the preparations with manic energy. Sarah found herself working even longer hours, her sleep reduced to brief periods of exhausted unconsciousness before the next day's demands began. Her hands, already damaged from constant labor, developed painful cracks that bled when she flexed her fingers. Patience showed her how to wrap them in scraps of cloth soaked in animal fat, a remedy that provided minimal relief but was the best available to those who owned nothing, not even their own bodies. The physical exhaustion was compounded by a new source of anxiety. Lawrence Witmore had begun noticing Sarah in a way that made her skin crawl, his eyes lingering on her developing form in a manner that old Thomas had warned her about months earlier. "When the master starts looking at a girl that way," Thomas had said quietly, "ain't nothing good coming. Best you can do is stay near other folks. Never be alone where he might corner you." Sarah heeded the warning, structuring her movements to ensure she was never isolated, always within sight of other servants or family members, hyper-aware of Witmore's location in the house at all times. The Thursday gathering in mid-November brought a conversation that would prove pivotal. The 8 mistresses assembled as usual, but this afternoon carried a different energy, a tension that Sarah sensed immediately. Amanda Thornton arrived with news that her husband's bank had foreclosed on a plantation 30 miles south, and the enslaved population would be auctioned to settle debts. The women discussed this development with animated interest, several expressing plans to attend the sale in search of bargains. They spoke of human beings like commodities on discount, calculating which skills might prove most valuable, which ages represented the best investment, which family configurations could be most profitably broken apart and redistributed. Sarah stood in her corner, holding the tea tray, listening to them plan the destruction of lives with the same enthusiasm they brought to planning parties. Eleanor Hayes expressed particular interest in acquiring young children, explaining that they could be trained to specific tasks and would provide decades of unpaid labor. Rebecca Chandler countered that older slaves with established skills represented better immediate value, though they lacked the long-term return on investment. The debate continued, 8 educated women applying sophisticated economic analysis to the question of how to most efficiently extract value from human flesh and suffering. Then Josephine Crawford made a comment that would echo through Sarah's consciousness for years to come. "I sometimes wonder," she said with a laugh that held no real humor, "if they understand their own condition. Do you think they grasp that they're property, or do they imagine themselves as people?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Margaret Witmore responded with certainty. "They're simple creatures, really, content with their lot if properly managed. It's only when outside agitators fill their heads with dangerous notions that problems arise. Left to their natural state, they're quite docile." The other women murmured agreement, building on this theme. They constructed an elaborate mythology of the contented slave, grateful for the civilization that slavery provided, incapable of complex thought or genuine emotion, naturally suited to servitude. They spoke of their own enslaved workers with a mixture of condescension and contempt, insisting that strict discipline was an act of kindness, that violence was necessary correction, that the separation of families prevented emotional attachments that would only cause unnecessary distress to simple minds incapable of deep feeling. Sarah felt rage building in her chest like physical pressure, a force so powerful she feared it might escape through her eyes or her trembling hands. Every word they spoke was a lie, and she knew it with perfect certainty. She carried memories of love, experienced grief for losses she could barely articulate, possessed hopes and dreams and fears as complex as any human being ever born. The community in the quarters demonstrated daily the profound bonds people formed despite every effort to crush their spirits. Lovers who found each other in the darkness, parents who cherished children they might lose at any moment, elders who passed down stories and strategies for survival, all of them human in ways these women refused to acknowledge, because to do so would demolish the moral justification for their entire way of life. But rage without outlet is a form of poison. Sarah could not speak, could not act, could not even let her feelings show on her face without risking severe punishment. So she did the only thing available to her. She memorized their words, stored their faces in her mind, catalogued each casual cruelty and willful delusion. She did not know yet what purpose this mental archive would serve, but some instinct told her to preserve it, to bear witness even if no one else would ever know. The conversation shifted to lighter topics: upcoming social events, fashion arriving from New Orleans, gossip about families not present to defend themselves. Sarah served tea and removed plates and stood motionless and invisible, while her interior world burned with suppressed fury. When the gathering finally ended and the mistresses departed, she moved through the cleanup tasks in a state of numb dissociation, her body performing familiar motions, while her mind struggled to contain feelings too large and dangerous to safely hold. That evening, after the main house had gone dark and quiet, Sarah sat on the steps of the cabin she shared with the other house servants. The November air bit at her skin, but she welcomed the physical discomfort as a distraction from the turmoil inside her. Patience emerged from the cabin and settled beside her, saying nothing at first, just offering the comfort of presence. After a long silence, the older woman spoke quietly. "You learning to hate them." It was not a question, and Sarah did not pretend otherwise. "Yes," she whispered, the admission feeling both dangerous and necessary. Patience nodded slowly. "That's natural. That's human. But you got to be careful with it. Hate without wisdom will get you killed. Hate without patience will get you sold. You got to learn to use it, not let it use you." Sarah turned to look at the older woman, seeing in the dim moonlight the lines that hard years had carved into her face, the scars on her arms from punishments endured, the strength that somehow persisted despite everything designed to break it. "How?" she asked simply. "You wait," Patience said. "You watch. You learn everything you can about how their world works, what they fear, where they're weak. You survive first, always survive first. But you remember too. You remember every single thing they do, every word they say, every time they prove they're the monsters they accuse us of being. And when the time comes, if it comes, you'll know what to do with that remembering." The advice settled into Sarah's bones like a seed finding soil. She did not fully understand yet what Patience meant, but the words gave shape to the formless rage, provided a framework for channeling it into something beyond immediate self-destruction. She could wait, she could watch, she could remember, and perhaps somehow, someday, there would be a reckoning. December arrived with preparations for the Christmas gathering that had consumed Mrs. Witmore's attention for months. The house buzzed with activity, as additional enslaved workers were brought in from the fields to assist with cleaning, decorating, and food preparation. Sarah found herself working 20-hour days, her exhaustion so profound that she sometimes moved through tasks in a dreamlike state, her body executing familiar motions while her consciousness drifted elsewhere. The night before the Christmas gathering, Margaret Witmore conducted an inspection of the house, finding fault with nearly everything. A window had streaks. A floor needed repolishing. The silver wasn't shined to adequate brightness. Each perceived imperfection resulted in sharp words and sharper slaps, the mistress working herself into a state of agitated fury as her anxiety about the upcoming event manifested as violence toward those who could not defend themselves. Sarah received 3 blows to her face for a wrinkle in a tablecloth, the force of the impacts making her ears ring, but she had learned not to cry out, not to touch her stinging skin, not to show any reaction beyond immediate compliance with the next command. The Christmas gathering itself proved even more elaborate than the weekly Thursday meetings. 15 women attended, representing the absolute peak of Vicksburg's social hierarchy, and Mrs. Witmore glowed with satisfaction at having assembled such a prestigious group. The parlor overflowed with expensive decorations, imported delicacies covered every surface, and enslaved servants moved through the crowd in carefully choreographed patterns designed to demonstrate the household's sophistication and efficiency. Sarah worked alongside 6 other servants, all of them performing their roles with the precision of a stage production. She had been assigned to circulate with refreshments, offering glasses of wine and plates of delicate pastries to women who took what they wanted without acknowledgement, as if the items appeared through magic rather than through the labor of human hands. The conversations swirled around her: politics, fashion, complaints about servants, expressions of satisfaction with the social order that placed them at its apex. Then, in a moment that would alter the trajectory of multiple lives, disaster struck in the form of a simple accident. Sarah was approaching Victoria Pemberton with a tray of wine glasses when another servant, a field hand pressed into service for the event who lacked experience with the intricate choreography of the parlor, stumbled backward directly into her path. Sarah tried to adjust, to maintain her balance, but the collision was unavoidable. The tray tilted, and red wine cascaded down the front of Victoria Pemberton's expensive silk dress, staining the pale blue fabric a deep crimson that spread like blood across the bodice. The room fell silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence, 15 pairs of eyes fixed on the scene, with the focused attention of predators sensing wounded prey. Victoria Pemberton stood frozen for a moment, looking down at her ruined dress with an expression of disbelief that rapidly transformed into incandescent rage. Sarah dropped to her knees immediately, apologies tumbling from her lips, but she already knew that no words would matter, that punishment was inevitable and would be severe. "You clumsy beast!" Victoria's voice cracked like a whip across the silent room. "This dress cost more than you're worth. Margaret, control your servants, or I'll see to the discipline myself." Margaret Witmore rushed forward, her face flushed with humiliation at the social catastrophe that had unfolded in her carefully orchestrated gathering. The other women watched with expressions ranging from sympathetic horror to barely concealed satisfaction, a few of them pleased to see the hostess's pretensions of perfect household management so publicly shattered. Sarah remained on her knees, her head bowed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for the violence she knew was coming. Block 3. The silence that followed Victoria Pemberton's outburst stretched for several seconds, each moment heavy with anticipation. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the floor, seeing only the intricate pattern of the imported carpet and the dark wine stains spreading across its surface, additional evidence of her catastrophic failure. Her mind raced through possible outcomes, each worse than the last: a public whipping, sale to a harsher household, transfer to fieldwork where the brutality would break her body within years. Or worse punishments she had heard whispered about but never witnessed, the kind that left permanent scars both visible and invisible. Margaret Witmore's voice, when it came, was tight with controlled fury. "Ladies, please accept my deepest apologies for this inexcusable disruption. Victoria, I will of course replace your dress at my own expense and see to the discipline of this careless girl immediately." She grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into the flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "Get to your feet. Go wait in the kitchen. Do not move from that spot until I come for you." Sarah rose on shaking legs and moved toward the kitchen, acutely aware of every eye following her retreat. Behind her she heard Mrs. Witmore attempting to restore the social equilibrium, offering additional refreshments and directing the conversation toward safer topics. But the damage was done. The carefully constructed illusion of effortless refinement had cracked, revealing the violence and control that lay beneath the surface of Southern gentility. In the kitchen, Patience was overseeing the preparation of additional food when Sarah entered. The older woman took one look at her face and understood immediately. "What happened?" "Wine on Mrs. Pemberton's dress," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't my fault. Another servant backed into me, but—" "Don't matter whose fault it was," Patience interrupted gently. "Never does." She pulled Sarah into a brief embrace, then stepped back and composed her features into neutrality as footsteps approached. "You be strong now. Whatever comes, you survive it. You hear me?" Sarah nodded just as Margaret Witmore swept into the kitchen, her face a mask of cold rage. "Come with me," she commanded, not waiting to see if Sarah followed. They moved through the back hallway to a small storage room that Sarah knew was sometimes used for punishment, its walls thick enough to muffle sounds that the mistress preferred guests not to hear. Lawrence Witmore was already there, holding a leather strap that he handed to his wife without comment, before positioning himself to observe. "You have humiliated me in front of the most important women in Vicksburg," Margaret Witmore said, her voice low and venomous. "Do you understand what you've done?" The cost of that dress is nothing compared to the damage to my reputation. I'm going to ensure you never forget this moment." The beating that followed was methodical and brutal. Sarah tried to count the blows at first, 10, 15, 20, but lost track as pain overwhelmed her ability to think clearly. The leather strap struck her back, her shoulders, her arms, when she instinctively raised them for protection. Mrs. Witmore delivered each blow with controlled force, spacing them to maximize pain, while avoiding damage that might reduce Sarah's ability to work. It was violence as calculated performance, punishment designed to reinforce hierarchy and crush any hint of resistance. When it finally ended, Sarah lay crumpled on the floor, her body a geography of pain, her dress torn and bloodied. Margaret Witmore stood over her, breathing hard from the exertion. "Clean yourself up and return to work," she commanded. "The gathering continues, and I expect you to serve with a smile on your face as if nothing happened. If you cannot manage that simple task, I will have you sold south to the cotton fields where you'll learn what real work means." Sarah forced herself to her feet, swaying slightly from pain and shock. She managed a whispered "yes, ma'am" before stumbling out of the room. In the kitchen, Patience was waiting with a damp cloth and a clean dress. The older woman worked quickly, washing the blood from Sarah's back and helping her change into fresh clothing. "Can you stand straight?" she asked quietly. Sarah tested her posture, feeling the pull of torn skin and forming bruises. "I have to," she replied simply. "That's right. You do what you have to do. You survive." Patience adjusted the dress to conceal as much damage as possible, then guided Sarah back toward the parlor. "You're stronger than they know. Remember that." Sarah returned to the gathering carrying a fresh tray of refreshments, her face composed into the blank servility that was expected, her movements careful to avoid revealing the agony each step caused. The mistresses had moved past the earlier disruption, their conversation flowing smoothly as if nothing significant had occurred. Victoria Pemberton had departed to change clothes, but the others remained, sipping wine and nibbling pastries, while the girl they had watched be dragged away for punishment served them as if transformed back into useful furniture. If you're still with us and finding this narrative compelling, we'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories of resistance and survival need to be told, and your engagement helps ensure they reach more people. Drop a comment and let us know your thoughts on Sarah's journey so far. Eleanor Hayes beckoned Sarah over with an imperious gesture. "More wine, girl." Sarah filled the glass with steady hands, despite the tremors running through her body, her face revealing nothing of the pain that made her want to scream. Hayes took the glass without looking at her, continuing her conversation about the upcoming social season as if Sarah didn't exist. The casual dismissal, the absolute indifference to the suffering they had caused and witnessed, struck Sarah as somehow worse than the violence itself. The gathering continued for another 2 hours. Sarah served and cleared and stood and waited, performing her role with mechanical precision, while some part of her consciousness retreated to a place beyond reach. She had learned this trick during previous punishments, the ability to separate her essential self from her physical body, to observe events from a distant remove that made the pain and humiliation feel like something happening to someone else. It was a survival mechanism that came with its own dangers, a form of dissociation that could, if relied upon too heavily, fragment the self into pieces that might never fully reconnect. When the last guest finally departed and the cleanup began, Sarah worked alongside the other servants to restore the parlor to its usual state. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her damaged back, but she showed no sign of it, having learned that displays of suffering only invited more cruelty. The other servants knew what had happened. Word spread quickly through the enslaved community, but no one spoke of it directly. They worked in companionable silence, their shared understanding needing no verbal expression. It was after midnight when Sarah finally made her way back to the cabin, exhausted beyond measure, but unable to sleep when she lay down on the thin pallet that served as her bed. Her back throbbed with each heartbeat, and she knew from experience that the pain would worsen over the next few days as bruises deepened and torn skin tried to heal. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological weight, the knowledge that this violence could happen again at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all, that her body existed at the absolute mercy of people who viewed her suffering as both necessary and righteous. Patience sat beside her in the darkness, applying a poultice of herbs to the worst of the welts. "I know it don't feel like it now," the older woman said quietly, "but you got through today. That counts for something. Every day you survive is a small victory they can't take from you." "It doesn't feel like victory," Sarah whispered. "It feels like dying by inches." "I know, child, I know." Patience's hand rested gently on Sarah's shoulder, one of the few places not damaged by the beating. "But you're still here. You're still breathing. You still got yourself the part of you they can't touch no matter what they do to your body. That's what you hold on to." The days following the Christmas gathering brought no respite. If anything, Margaret Witmore drove the household staff harder, as if determined to restore her sense of perfect control after the public embarrassment. Sarah worked through pain that made simple tasks feel monumental, her healing injuries protesting every movement. She developed a slight fever as her body fought infection in the deeper welts, but there was no question of rest or medical care. Enslaved workers received treatment only when their condition threatened their ability to labor, and Sarah's injuries, while painful, did not prevent her from performing her duties. The Thursday gatherings resumed in January, with the 8 core mistresses plus Elizabeth Brennan, who had become a regular attendee. Sarah noticed that the young woman watched her with something that might have been concern or curiosity, a heightened attention that made Sarah uneasy. Being noticed even sympathetically was dangerous. It drew attention that could lead to unwanted complications, to questions about why one servant merited special consideration when the entire system depended on treating the enslaved population as interchangeable units of labor. The conversations among the mistresses that winter grew increasingly political as national tensions over slavery intensified. The Fugitive Slave Act had passed the previous year, and the women discussed with satisfaction the increased mechanisms for capturing and returning escaped slaves. They spoke approvingly of violence against abolitionists, celebrating attacks on those who questioned the divine right of white Southerners to own human beings. Their certainty was absolute, their moral universe constructed on foundations they never examined, their complicity in a system of extraordinary cruelty justified by myths they had absorbed since childhood and never thought to question. Sarah listened and remembered. Each conversation added to her growing understanding of how the system functioned, where its vulnerabilities lay, what these women feared most. She began to recognize patterns in their anxieties, the terror of slave rebellion that lurked beneath their assertions of control, the economic dependency that made their wealth contingent on continued subjugation, the psychological fragility of worldviews built on deliberate delusion. They were powerful, but their power rested on foundations more precarious than they acknowledged. In February, an incident occurred that would prove significant in ways no one anticipated. During a Thursday gathering, Josephine Crawford mentioned that she had dismissed her personal maid after discovering the woman teaching herself to read using a discarded primer. The other mistresses reacted with immediate alarm, expressing approval for Crawford's swift action and debating the proper punishment for such dangerous behavior. Literacy among the enslaved was forbidden by law and custom, viewed as a direct threat to the system's stability. "Ignorance is essential to their proper management," Margaret Witmore declared with authority. "An educated Negro is a dangerous Negro. They must be kept simple and focused on their duties. Any attempt at learning is evidence of dangerous ambition that must be crushed immediately." The conversation continued along these lines for some time, the women reinforcing each other's certainty that knowledge was too dangerous to be permitted to those they enslaved. But Sarah, listening from her corner, felt something shift in her understanding. The vehemence of their reaction, the fear beneath their confident assertions, revealed a truth they were trying to hide even from themselves. They were terrified of what might happen if enslaved people gained access to education, to the intellectual tools that might allow them to articulate their condition, to organize resistance, to claim the full humanity that the system depended on denying. If knowledge was a threat to them, Sarah reasoned, then knowledge was a weapon she needed to acquire. But how? She could not read or write, had no access to books or formal instruction, existed under constant surveillance that made any attempt at self-education extraordinarily dangerous. The puzzle occupied her thoughts for days, turning over possibilities and discarding them as too risky or impractical. The answer came from an unexpected source. Elizabeth Brennan, during a gathering in late February, dropped a small book while reaching for her teacup. Sarah retrieved it immediately, handing it back without looking at the cover. But in that brief moment of contact their eyes met. Elizabeth held her gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, something unreadable passing across the young woman's face. Then the moment passed. Elizabeth took the book with a quiet "thank you," and the gathering continued without incident. But that night, Sarah found a piece of paper tucked into the pocket of her dress, a page torn from a primer containing the alphabet printed in clear letters with corresponding simple words for each. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, "Hide this, memorize it, destroy it." No signature, but Sarah knew where it had come from. The gift was dangerous for both of them. If discovered, Elizabeth would face social censure and Sarah would face brutal punishment. But it was also a lifeline, an opening into the world of knowledge that the system fought so hard to deny her. Sarah spent the next weeks memorizing that single page, studying it in stolen moments when she was alone in the cabin before dawn or after dark. She traced the letters with her fingers, sounded out the words silently, committed every detail to memory until she could reproduce the entire page in her mind with perfect accuracy. Then, as instructed, she burned it carefully, scattering the ashes where they would never be found. The knowledge remained, though, encoded in her consciousness, where no one could take it from her. Spring arrived in Vicksburg with an explosion of color and life that seemed to mock the darkness of human cruelty contained within the town's elegant homes. Azaleas bloomed in riots of pink and white. Dogwood trees spread delicate branches over manicured lawns, and the air grew thick with the mingled scents of wisteria and jasmine. The Mississippi River swelled with snowmelt from the north, and steamboats arrived daily carrying goods and people and news from a nation sliding inexorably toward confrontation over the question of slavery. Sarah turned 13 that spring, though the exact date of her birth remained unknown to her. Age was marked not by celebrations, but by physical changes and expanding capacity for labor. She had grown taller over the winter, her body developing in ways that increased her vulnerability to certain dangers. Lawrence Witmore's attention had become more pronounced, and Sarah maintained constant vigilance to avoid situations where he might corner her alone. The other enslaved women had taught her strategies: always travel in pairs when possible, stay in well-lit areas, cultivate the protection of older male servants who could provide a buffer, make herself as unappealing as possible through posture and demeanor when in his presence. The knowledge Sarah had gained from that single page of primer had ignited something that could not be extinguished. She began to notice written words everywhere, on boxes in the storeroom, on letters left carelessly on tables, on newspapers that Lawrence Witmore discarded after reading. She could not yet read fluently, but she could recognize individual letters and sound out simple words, piecing together meaning through context and patient observation. Each small victory expanded her understanding of the world beyond the narrow confines of her lived experience. Elizabeth Brennan continued to attend the Thursday gatherings, and twice more over the spring months, Sarah found small gifts hidden in places only she would discover. Another page of text, a list of common words with their definitions, once even a small slate pencil wrapped in cloth. The young woman never acknowledged these gifts directly, maintaining perfect social decorum in public, while engaging in an act of quiet rebellion that could destroy both their lives if discovered. Sarah did not fully understand Elizabeth's motivations, could not reconcile the cognitive dissonance of someone who participated in the culture of enslavement, while simultaneously undermining one of its foundational mechanisms of control. The Thursday gatherings that spring carried an undercurrent of anxiety that the Mistresses tried to disguise beneath their usual performances of refined conversation. National politics intruded increasingly into their carefully constructed social bubble. Debates over slavery's expansion into new territories dominated newspapers and political discourse, and even in the insulated world of Vicksburg's elite, the tremors of coming conflict could be felt. The women responded by intensifying their defense of the peculiar institution, their conversations taking on an almost desperate quality as they reassured each other of slavery's moral necessity and divine sanction. "The abolitionists are insane fanatics who would destroy our entire civilization," Amanda Thornton declared during an April gathering. "They understand nothing of the natural order, of the proper hierarchy that God himself established. The Negro is suited for labor under white guidance, just as the child requires parental authority. To suggest otherwise is to invite chaos and ruin." The other mistresses murmured agreement, each contributing their own variations on this theme. They spoke of economic catastrophe if slavery ended, of racial warfare that would inevitably follow emancipation, of their own benevolence as slaveholders who provided care and Christian instruction to people who would be helpless without their guidance. The mythology they constructed was elaborate and self-serving, designed to insulate them from the moral horror of their actions by reframing exploitation as charity and violence as necessary correction. Sarah listened and catalogued their words. Her growing literacy, allowing her to understand the logical contradictions in their arguments. If enslaved people were truly happy and content in their condition, why did the system require such elaborate mechanisms of control and punishment? If they were genuinely incapable of complex thought, why did the law forbid teaching them to read? If slavery was such a benevolent institution, why did it require constant violence to maintain? The questions multiplied in her mind, but she kept them hidden behind her mask of servility, performing her role while her interior world expanded in directions her enslavers could not see. In May, an event occurred that would accelerate Sarah's education in ways both illuminating and traumatic. A young enslaved man named Daniel, who worked in the Witmore stables, was discovered attempting to escape. He had made it 15 miles north before slave catchers tracked him down and returned him to Lawrence Witmore's custody. What followed was a public spectacle designed to terrorize the entire enslaved community into submission. Witmore assembled all 23 enslaved people who worked on his property in the yard behind the main house. Daniel was bound to a post, his shirt removed to expose his back. Witmore delivered a speech about the wages of disobedience and ingratitude, about the natural order that placed white men in authority over those of African descent, about the necessity of harsh punishment to maintain proper discipline. Then he administered 50 lashes with a bullwhip, each strike tearing flesh and drawing blood, while Daniel's screams echoed across the property. Sarah was forced to watch along with everyone else. The brutality seared into her consciousness with deliberate intent. This was the system revealing its true face, stripping away any pretense of benevolence to show the raw violence that underpinned every aspect of enslavement. The message was clear. Resistance would be crushed, attempts at freedom would be punished with extraordinary cruelty, and the entire community would be forced to witness the consequences as a reminder of their own powerlessness. But the spectacle had an unintended effect. As Sarah watched Daniel's punishment, watched Lawrence Witmore's face contorted with rage and something darker, watched the other enslaved people's expressions of horror and helpless fury, she felt something crystallize in her understanding. This system depended on fear, but fear was not the same as acceptance. Every person forced to witness that brutality carried away their own reaction, their own internal response that the enslavers could not fully control. Some would be cowed into deeper submission, yes, but others would feel their resolve harden, their hatred sharpen, their determination to survive and someday resist grow stronger. Daniel was sold the following week to a cotton plantation deep in Louisiana. His attempted escape used as justification to remove him permanently from the area. The remaining enslaved population absorbed his absence in grim silence. Another loss in a lifetime of losses, another reminder of the system's absolute power over their bodies and futures. But in the quarters at night, people spoke in whispers about Daniel's courage, about the 15 miles of freedom he had claimed before recapture, about the possibility that others had made it farther and might even now be living free in northern states. These whispered conversations revealed an underground network of knowledge and hope that existed beneath the surface of enforced submission. People tracked news of successful escapes, passed along information about routes north and sympathetic contacts, maintained a collective memory of resistance that contradicted the narrative of contentment and docility that enslavers told themselves. Sarah absorbed this knowledge eagerly, understanding that she was being initiated into a tradition of survival and defiance that stretched back generations. The Thursday gatherings in June brought renewed focus to the Mistresses' anxieties about slave rebellion. News had reached Vicksburg of an alleged plot uncovered in a neighboring county, and the women discussed it with a mixture of horror and vindication. "You see," Victoria Pemberton said triumphantly, "this is what happens when discipline grows lax. The moment we show weakness, they become dangerous. Constant vigilance and firm punishment are the only means of maintaining order." The conversation devolved into increasingly paranoid speculation about which of their own enslaved workers might harbor rebellious thoughts. They traded advice about surveillance techniques, about breaking family bonds to prevent organized resistance, about the importance of crushing any sign of independent thought or collective solidarity. Their fear was palpable, and Sarah recognized it as both rational and inadequate. Rational because they were vastly outnumbered by the people they oppressed. Inadequate because they fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of those they enslaved. They assumed that sufficient brutality would create genuine submission, that violence could reshape consciousness itself, that they could make people believe in their own inferiority through sheer force. But Sarah knew differently. Every enslaved person she had ever known maintained an interior space that no amount of violence could fully penetrate, a core of selfhood that persisted despite everything designed to destroy it. The enslavers controlled bodies and movements and labor, but they could not ultimately control thought, imagination, or the stubborn human capacity to hope for something better. July brought oppressive heat that made every task more exhausting, the air so thick with humidity that breathing itself felt like labor. The main house became stifling despite all efforts to circulate air, and the mistresses grew irritable, their tempers shortening as temperatures climbed. Sarah moved through her duties in a state of perpetual exhaustion, her nights offering little rest in the airless cabin, her days an endless succession of demands, delivered by women made cruel by discomfort and the particular frustrations of their limited lives. It was during a particularly brutal Thursday gathering in late July that the incident occurred, which would begin the chain of events leading to consequences no one could have anticipated. The 8 mistresses had assembled despite the heat, too committed to their weekly ritual to let weather interfere. They were discussing the upcoming harvest season when Catherine Brennan made a casual comment about Sarah's developing appearance, noting that she would soon be old enough for breeding. The remark was delivered with the same tone she might use to discuss livestock management, and the other women responded in kind. They debated Sarah's potential value as a breeder, assessed her physical characteristics for desirable traits that might be passed to offspring, discussed which male slaves might produce the most valuable children. Margaret Witmore mentioned that Lawrence had already expressed interest in that particular use of Sarah's developing body, and the women laughed knowingly, understanding the euphemism for what it meant. Sarah stood in her corner, holding a tray of lemonade, her face carefully blank as they discussed her future violation, as if it were an agricultural decision. But inside, something fractured. The careful control she had maintained, the protective dissociation that had allowed her to endure countless humiliations, all of it threatened to shatter under the weight of hearing her rape planned casually over tea and pastries. She felt dizzy, the room seeming to tilt around her, her hands beginning to tremble with rage and horror and absolute helplessness. Elizabeth Brennan, seated beside her mother, had gone pale. The young woman stared at her teacup, her hands gripping it tightly enough that her knuckles showed white. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, clearly struggling with some internal conflict. The moment stretched, tension building that only 2 people in the room seemed to feel, while the other mistresses continued their discussion of Sarah's reproductive future with clinical detachment. Then Elizabeth stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, her teacup clattering onto its saucer, with enough force to crack the delicate porcelain. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight. "I need air." She fled the room before anyone could respond, leaving behind a moment of confused silence. Catherine Brennan laughed uncomfortably. "Young women are so delicate. The heat must have overcome her." The other mistresses murmured agreement, and the conversation resumed its previous course, as if the interruption had been meaningless. But Sarah had seen Elizabeth's face in that moment before she fled, had recognized something in her expression that looked almost like moral horror breaking through years of careful social conditioning. The gathering ended earlier than usual, the heat making even the most dedicated socialites willing to abbreviate their ritual. As the mistresses departed, Sarah moved mechanically through clean-up tasks, her mind far away from the physical actions her body performed. She felt something fundamental shifting in her understanding of her situation, a recognition that she could not continue indefinitely in this state of perpetual violation and degradation. The prospect of what Lawrence Witmore intended, what the mistresses had discussed so casually, made continuation unbearable. That night, lying in the stifling darkness of the cabin, Sarah made a decision. She did not yet know how or when, but she would find a way to escape this place or die trying. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it brought a strange calm, a sense of purpose that replaced the crushing helplessness she had carried for so long. Patience had told her to survive, to wait, to watch, but survival at any cost was not the same as life, and Sarah was beginning to understand that some fates were worse than death. Block 5. August brought no relief from the oppressive heat, but it did bring change in forms both subtle and catastrophic. Sarah moved through her 13th summer with a new awareness sharpening her perceptions, every interaction filtered through the lens of her decision to somehow claim freedom or die in the attempt. She did not confide this resolution to anyone, understanding that even Patience, with all her wisdom and sympathy, might try to dissuade her from such dangerous thinking. The decision belonged to Sarah alone, carried in the secret chambers of her heart, where no amount of surveillance could penetrate. The Thursday gatherings continued their clockwork rhythm, but Sarah noticed shifts in the dynamics among the mistresses. Elizabeth Brennan had become increasingly withdrawn during the meetings, participating minimally in conversations, and often appearing lost in troubled thought. Her mother watched her with growing concern, occasionally making pointed comments about the importance of maintaining proper social connections and not developing unseemly sensibilities. The tension between them was subtle but unmistakable to someone like Sarah, who had learned to read the smallest variations in white people's moods as a matter of survival. On the second Thursday of August, during a gathering where the conversation had turned to the upcoming cotton harvest and the profits it promised, Elizabeth stood abruptly and addressed the room with trembling voice. "I cannot continue pretending that what we discuss here is acceptable. We speak of human beings as property, plan violations as business strategies, discuss cruelty as household management. It is monstrous, and I can no longer participate in it silently." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Catherine Brennan's face flushed deep red with humiliation and fury. "Elizabeth, what has possessed you? Sit down this instant and apologize to Mrs. Witmore and her guests." But Elizabeth remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides, her voice gaining strength even as it shook. "No, Mother, I have spent months watching and listening and trying to reconcile what I see here with what I know to be true in my heart. These are people, not animals, not property, not simple creatures without feelings. They suffer as we would suffer. They love as we love. They deserve freedom as much as any human being ever born." The silence that followed was absolute. 8 mistresses stared at the young woman, with expressions ranging from shock to fury to something approaching fear. She had violated the fundamental social contract of their world, speaking aloud truths that the entire system depended on keeping hidden beneath layers of mythology and rationalization. Margaret Witmore recovered first, her voice cold with controlled rage. "Your daughter has clearly been influenced by abolitionist propaganda. Catherine, I suggest you remove her from this gathering immediately and take steps to correct her dangerous delusions before she embarrasses your family further." Catherine Brennan stood, gripping Elizabeth's arm with visible force. "We are leaving. Elizabeth, you will come with me now, and we will discuss this at home." She pulled her daughter toward the door, but Elizabeth resisted for a moment, her eyes finding Sarah's across the room. In that brief connection, Sarah saw recognition, apology, desperate hope that some good might come from this social catastrophe. Then the moment passed, and Elizabeth allowed herself to be dragged from the parlor. The remaining mistresses erupted into agitated conversation, their voices overlapping as they processed what had just occurred. They spoke of the dangerous influence of northern ideas, of young women's susceptibility to emotional manipulation, of the absolute necessity of maintaining ideological unity in the face of growing abolitionist pressure. Their anxiety was palpable. Elizabeth's outburst had torn a hole in the carefully maintained facade of moral certainty, forcing them to confront, however briefly, the possibility that their entire way of life rested on foundations of deliberate evil. Victoria Pemberton turned to Margaret Witmore with barely concealed satisfaction beneath her expression of concern. "I do hope this incident won't reflect poorly on your gatherings, Margaret. Perhaps stricter attention to who attends would prevent such disruptions in future." The implied criticism struck its target. Mrs. Witmore's social position, already damaged by the wine incident months earlier, had taken another blow. Her response was swift and vicious. She turned to Sarah, who had remained frozen in her corner throughout the entire scene. This is your fault somehow. Your presence has brought nothing but chaos to this household. Get out of my sight before I have you beaten for the disruption you've caused." Sarah fled, the irrational accusation rolling off her like water. She had learned long ago that white people's need to assign blame for their own failures often landed on the nearest enslaved person, regardless of logic or justice. But as she retreated to the kitchen, her mind raced with the implications of what had just occurred. Elizabeth had spoken truth to power and paid an immediate social price for it. Whether her courage would amount to anything beyond personal consequences remained unknown. But Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of possibility. That night, word spread through the enslaved quarters about the incident at the Thursday gathering. Stories like this traveled fast, passing from house servant to field hand to cook to stable worker through whispered conversations and coded messages. The tale grew slightly in the telling, as such stories did, but the essential truth remained. A white woman had publicly denounced slavery in the heart of Vicksburg society. For people accustomed to seeing white solidarity as absolute and impenetrable, the crack in the facade felt significant, even if its practical implications remained unclear. 2 days later, Sarah discovered a note hidden in her assigned cleaning supplies, a piece of paper folded small and tucked where only she would find it. The message was brief, written in Elizabeth's neat hand. "I am being sent to relatives in Kentucky as punishment for my outburst. Before I go, I wanted you to know that what I said was true, and I am sorry for not saying it sooner. You deserve freedom. Remember that you are fully human, no matter what they tell you. There is a family named Morrison who operate a dry goods store on Monroe Street. They are sympathetic to those seeking freedom. I pray you survive and find your way to liberation." Sarah memorized the message and burned it immediately, understanding both the gift Elizabeth had given her and the enormous risk the young woman had taken in providing such information. The Morrison family, potential allies, possible connection to the Underground Railroad that everyone knew existed, but no one spoke of openly. The knowledge was dangerous, the kind that could get her killed if discovered, but it was also a lifeline, a thread of possibility in the suffocating darkness of her captivity. September arrived with slightly cooler temperatures and heightened tension in the Witmore household. Margaret Witmore had become increasingly erratic, following the twin humiliations of the wine incident and Elizabeth's outburst. Her treatment of the enslaved staff grew harsher, her punishments more severe, her demands more unreasonable. She seemed determined to reassert absolute control after events that had undermined her authority, and that determination manifested as intensified cruelty toward those who could not defend themselves. Sarah bore the brunt of this displaced rage, receiving beatings for infractions so minor as to be almost invisible, a tea service not arranged to exact specifications, a moment's hesitation before responding to a command, the mere suspicion of an impudent expression. The violence became nearly daily, wearing down Sarah's body and spirit with relentless efficiency. But paradoxically, it also strengthened her resolve. Each beating confirmed that this situation was unsustainable, that she could not continue indefinitely in this state, that escape was not merely desirable, but absolutely necessary for survival. The Thursday gatherings had been suspended following Elizabeth's outburst, Margaret Witmore unwilling to risk further social catastrophe. But the individual mistresses continued their private communications, and Sarah overheard enough fragments of conversation to understand that Catherine Brennan had indeed sent Elizabeth away, and that the girl's dangerous ideas were being discussed throughout Vicksburg's elite circles as a cautionary tale about the corruption of young minds by abolitionist propaganda. In late September, Lawrence Witmore made his intentions explicit. He cornered Sarah in the upstairs hallway one afternoon when his wife was occupied elsewhere, pressing her against the wall and making clear what he expected from her. "You're old enough now," he said, his breath hot on her face. "Tonight, you'll come to my study after the house is asleep. Don't make me come find you, girl." Sarah nodded mutely, her mind racing as terror and rage fought for dominance in her chest. When he released her and walked away, she stood trembling in the hallway, understanding that the moment she had dreaded had finally arrived. She could not comply. The violation would destroy something essential in her, would break her spirit in ways that all the beatings had not managed. But refusal meant punishment that would be equally devastating and probably sail to somewhere even worse than the Witmore household. That night, instead of going to Lawrence Witmore's study, Sarah went to Patience in the cabin. The older woman listened to her whispered account of the afternoon's encounter, her face growing grave. "You got choices. None of them good," Patience said quietly. "You can submit and let it kill you slowly from the inside. You can refuse and face whatever punishment he decides. Or you can run. If I run and get caught, then you face terrible consequences. Yes, but if you stay, you face terrible consequences guaranteed. At least running gives you a chance, small as it might be." Patience pulled Sarah close, holding her with fierce protectiveness. "I've watched you grow up here, watched you survive things that would break most people. You're stronger than you know and smarter than they suspect. If you're going to run, do it smart. Use everything you've learned about how their world works. And remember that surviving isn't the same as living. Sometimes you got to risk everything to claim actual life instead of just existence." Sarah spent the remaining hours before dawn making her decision and forming her plan. She knew where Lawrence Witmore kept money in his study. She knew the locations of the slave patrols and their typical routes. She had the name of the Morrison family and their store location. She had literacy enough to read basic signs and documents. And she had something perhaps more valuable than any of these practical resources. She had intimate knowledge of the mistresses who had tormented her, detailed understanding of their fears and vulnerabilities, information that might prove useful in ways she had not yet fully imagined. The plan that formed in her mind was audacious and probably suicidal, but it had a certain symmetry that appealed to her sense of justice. Before she ran, she would strike back at those who had brutalized her. She would expose the violence they tried to hide beneath civilized exteriors. She would force them to face consequences for their cruelty, even knowing that those consequences would fall far short of true justice. It was revenge and resistance intertwined, a way of claiming agency even in the face of overwhelming power. Over the next week, Sarah carefully prepared. She stole small amounts of money from places it would not be immediately missed, accumulating a modest sum that might help her survival. She memorized maps she glimpsed in Lawrence Witmore's study, learning the geography between Vicksburg and points north. She listened more carefully than ever to conversations among the enslaved community, gathering intelligence about escape routes and potential allies, and she began documenting, with her limited literacy, details of the abuse she had witnessed and experienced. Names, dates, specific acts of violence, information that might someday prove valuable if it reached sympathetic hands. The opportunity came in early October, during a rare moment when the main house was nearly empty. Margaret Witmore had gone visiting, taking most of the household staff with her for an elaborate social call. Lawrence Witmore was at his office in town. Sarah had perhaps 3 hours of relative freedom, and she used them with focused efficiency. She moved through the house systematically, gathering the money she had identified, taking a few items of clothing that might help her pass as a free person, collecting the documentation she had created. Then she did something that would ensure there was no going back. She entered Margaret Witmore's private sitting room and destroyed it methodically. She tore expensive dresses to ribbons, smashed imported china, scattered private correspondence across the floor, and left written on the mirror in soap a simple message: "We are human. We remember. We will be free." The act was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. Sarah knew that when the destruction was discovered, the response would be savage. But she also knew she would not be there to face it, because by the time Margaret Witmore returned and found her sanctuary violated, Sarah would already be running north toward an uncertain fate that had to be better than the certain horror of remaining. She left the Witmore estate as the sun set, walking with forced casualness through streets she had rarely traveled, her heart pounding, but her face composed. She carried nothing that would identify her as enslaved, had practiced the bearing and speech patterns of a free black person, relied on the gathering darkness to conceal details that might give her away. When she reached Monroe Street and found the Morrison dry goods store, she stood outside for a long moment, gathering courage for what came next. The store was closing for the day when she entered. A middle-aged white couple looked up at her arrival, their expressions guarded but not hostile. Sarah approached the counter, her voice steady despite her terror. "Elizabeth Brennan sent me," she said quietly. "She said you might help someone seeking freedom." The couple exchanged a long look before the woman responded. "Lock the door," she told her husband, then turned back to Sarah. "You're in danger every moment you remain in this town. We can hide you until tomorrow night, then get you on a route north, but you must understand the risks. If you're caught, we cannot protect you, and you will face consequences worse than anything you've experienced so far." "I understand," Sarah replied, "and I'm ready. Whatever comes, it has to be better than what I'm leaving behind." As the Morrisons led her to a hidden room behind the store, where she would spend the next 30 hours in terrified waiting, Sarah thought about the 8 mistresses who had tormented her for years. By now, Margaret Witmore would have discovered the destruction of her sitting room. By morning, all of Vicksburg would know that an enslaved girl had struck back before disappearing. The story would spread, carrying with it a message that the enslaved could resist, that they possessed agency and courage, and the capacity for strategic action. Sarah did not know if she would make it to freedom. The odds were against her, the distance vast, the dangers innumerable. But she had claimed her humanity through resistance, had refused to accept the role of passive victim that her enslavers demanded. Whatever happened next, she would face it as a person who had chosen her own path rather than one who simply endured whatever violence others inflicted. The journey north would take months and test her in ways she could not yet imagine. She would face slave catchers and sympathetic strangers, brutal weather and moments of grace, terror, and hope in equal measure. But she would also carry with her the memory of 8 mistresses who had mocked her pain and never imagined she possessed the intelligence, courage, and capacity for resistance to strike back before claiming her freedom. Their comfortable certainty in their own superiority had blinded them to the humanity and agency of the girl they had brutalized, and that blindness had been their fundamental mistake. Sarah's story was one of thousands, part of a vast tapestry of resistance and resilience that challenged the mythology of slavery as a benign institution maintained through mutual consent. Every person who ran toward freedom, every act of sabotage and resistance, every moment of claimed agency and dignity, these added up to a collective refutation of the lies that enslavers told themselves to justify their cruelty. The Mistresses of Vicksburg represented a system that would eventually fall, brought down not by its own contradictions alone, but by the accumulated resistance of those it sought to dehumanize. As Sarah waited in the darkness of her hiding place for the journey to begin, she remembered Patience's words, "You survive first, always survive first, but you remember too." She had survived and she had remembered, and now she was choosing to live rather than merely exist. The 8 mistresses who had fallen into shocked horror at discovering her resistance would never forget the lesson she had taught them, that the people they enslaved were fully human, capable of strategic thought and moral courage, determined to claim freedom regardless of the cost. Thank you for staying with us through Sarah's powerful story of resilience and resistance. If this narrative moved you or taught you something about this dark chapter of history, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with others who need to hear these important stories. Drop a comment below and let us know what aspects of Sarah's journey resonated most with you and where in the world you're watching from. These stories of courage in the face of unimaginable oppression deserve to be remembered and shared.